Welcome to our Festival of Archaeology session on sporting heritage. My name's Neil Redfern. I'm the Executive Director of the Council for British Archaeology, and I'm really pleased to be joined today by a really good friend and former colleague of mine, Dr. Keith Emerick from England, and also Jason Wood from Heritage Consultancy Services over the border in Lancashire, to talk to us about their work they've been doing at Bootham Crescent football ground in York. You might know some of the history of Bootham Crescent. It is due to be sold off and housing built on it as part of a long-running deal to save the club from some of the financial trouble it's had in the past. And Keith was really instrumental in leading a project and getting Jason involved to try and explore what the sense of place around Bootham Park is, what people feel about it, and actually how do you manage the process of losing a football club in your city? In a sense, whilst the football club survives and is moving to a new location, what does the ground mean to people? And how do you express that in the future and capture some of those memories? Bootham Crescent's been football ground since 1932, so nearly 90 plus years there. Really, really important to that local area. What do you actually do to try and capture some of that interest? So what we're going to do is we're going to have a little bit of Keith setting the scene, telling us how he approached the project, how the project came about, and he's going to pass on to Jason, who's going to talk to you about what we've actually done in this project and what some of the outcomes are. And then we're going to come back and actually have a little bit of a discussion to explore through questions from yourselves and questions we've got for each other about what next, where might you take this idea of sporting heritage, how to create some methodology, some approaches that we might want to use elsewhere. And indeed, we've got some examples of where there are other projects in the pipeline. Now, to help you navigate through this and get you asking questions, I'm just going to give you a little bit of Zoom webinar protocol. So at the bottom of the bar, if you scroll down to the bottom of your screen, a bar should pop up on which you will have the opportunities to ask questions. It's titled Q&A, and if you click on that, you can type in questions to there that all the participants can actually see, and then the panelists can actually look to answer. And what I will do when we get the moment is I will actually read some of those questions out for Keith and for Jason so that they can actually answer them. It's best if you put your questions in the Q&A box, because then everyone can see them, and when they're responded to, everyone sees the responses. If you happen to use the chat, don't panic. What I'll do is I'll read those questions out in live time when we get to the questions section, so everyone can see them. So we've got about half an hour, 40 minutes of conversation with Keith and Jason leading that, and then plenty of time for questions. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Keith. Keith will set the scene for us and then pass you on to Jason. Thank you. Keith.
Right, thank you very much, Neil. Yes, and before I pitch in, it's worth saying that there was an article in The Guardian yesterday in the sports section about the proposed demolition of the San Siro Stadium in Milan. And not casting aspersions, but the Italian Cultural Agency, when they were approached about this, they said, yes, it's absolutely fine. Go ahead and demolish the San Siro because it has absolutely no cultural interest whatsoever. And this is the ground where AC Milan and Inter Milan played. World Cups have been played there. World Cup matches have been played there. And it's very interesting to see the comments underneath this article in The Guardian and people saying this is ridiculous. It has huge amounts of cultural interest. It may not be worth saving, but it has huge amounts of cultural interest. So that's kind of a very modern example from yesterday. So there were three sort of strands for me about this project. The idea that York City were going to move from Bootham Crescent has been around for quite a long time, and they were going to move from Bootham Crescent and they were going to go to a new out of town ground. And that has happened to a lot of football clubs, and there has been a lot of discussion about the kind of the change in atmosphere and the change in experience from moving from a town to out of town. There are a lot of clubs at the moment who are going through hard times. They're thinking about moving their ground, or actually clubs that are um, close to winding up. So poor old Macclesfield has gone, Bury practically gone, Brentford have moved, Luton Town will be moving as well. So there are lots of examples of clubs perhaps losing heritage, losing history, losing meaning by actually disappearing or moving grounds. So that idea had been around for a long time that York City were going to move. The second thing for me is that I have a very particular idea about heritage and what it is. For me, heritage isn't old fabric. It's about people, memory, story, experience, diversity, creativity, identity, inclusion. It's all of those. It's all of those things. And there's a great opportunity to kind of talk about those things in relation to York City. Now, the third strand, is that Historic England is committed to placemaking. And because of the way I think about heritage, I wanted to have a better understanding of how you can use heritage in that broad sense to make a distinctive place. Um, and the thing is, it might not just be a football ground, it could be any place. As an organization, we get a lot of emails and phone calls from people saying we are going to lose our theatre or music venue. It may not be a kind of a listed building or in a conservation area, and they say, what can you do to help? And one of the things I wanted to do with this project was to try and explore how you use all the memory and meaning and story and association and experience and emotion, and be able to talk to a developer and actually come up with a new place that kind of represents or kind of embodies, in some respects, those experiences. But as I say, it could be a music venue or whatever. So one of the things I want out of this is a sort of a how-to guide that anybody can use when it comes to kind of recording a place that they may lose. And there is a lot of heritage literature out there that's all about critical heritage studies, cultural heritage management studies. And for me, the Bootham Crescent project was a way of actually finding out how some of that heritage theory literature could actually be turned into practice. And because some of it is very dense, has really long words that I struggle with and really complicated ideas. And there seemed to be a gap between, okay, if you take all that stuff in, what do you do on Monday morning when you go into work? How do you actually make your job and your interest different? How do you turn all of that into practice? And of course, there is a fourth thing. I am a football fan, and I know that football and football grounds are layered in meaning and values. And going to a football game and being involved is a cultural experience. You don't have to live at that place. I mean, you don't have to live. There are lots of people who follow York City who still live in Australia or New Zealand, as we found out. And so the place for them has what I think of as existence value. The fact that it is there is important to them. So I felt it was a really important project, and one that could answer a lot of questions, and could have some very positive outcomes. And I'd known about Jason from the work that he did at Bradford Park Avenue, which he may refer to. And I'll hand you over now to Jason so he can actually kind of talk about the fine detail of the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith, for that illuminating and interesting introduction to what we've been grappling with over the last couple of years in as far as the project at Bootham Crescent is concerned. The two words I picked out from that list you ran off are place and memory, which and interrogating the relationship between place and memory and between the tangible and the intangible heritage is always difficult. But as established, for football, it's an important challenge and one that remains under-researched and can have other benefits beyond sport and recreation into other fields. And as Keith has said, the redevelopment of Bootham Crescent for housing offered us this opportunity to explore and meet this challenge and to test in imaginative and innovative ways of involving people, the fan base in particular, for whom the ground holds great meaning. And particularly to explore why they value the site and, crucially, how it should be memorialized. And we began by setting some objectives and identifying the audience. We wanted to explain the project to as many people as possible so that they could share their memories. This was an important way of getting their support. And also to start exploring ways in which the future development could be shaped and to build support for that and therefore help influence the future development. And the key audiences for gathering these memories and ideas were, of course, the football club itself, the supporters trust, local residents, local businesses, and the worldwide fan base. But other stakeholders we wished to involve from the beginning were the preferred housing developer, in this case Persimmon, a local housing building firm, the planning authority, local politicians, and media. Now, there's an awful lot of data which was generated in the early stages of the project, but I think the MP, Rachel Maskell, sums up the overriding feeling about what this place means to people, fans and residents of York, and how sensitively we should be thinking about its redevelopment and reflecting that in the design, as she says, of new houses and the public realm. We must ensure, she says, that this strong legacy is maintained. And crucially, this is the interesting thing from my perspective, there should be an accessible physical space, a focal point for memory to which people can go back to time and time again to think about events in York City's history. So an accessible physical space and a focal point for memory. Sadly, such thought processes have not been always considered in advance of redeveloping of other football grounds in the past. So the project also, as well as interrogating local people in York, set about trying to learn lessons and drawing inspiration from previous redevelopments. Now, there aren't many success stories, and those which we found are not exactly relatable to Bootham Crescent, but I'll just point you in the right direction of a couple. The plan form of the original ground ought to be respected if possible. Imaginative design, creative use of space, perhaps the inclusion of artworks, and the potential for generating sport tourism were all issues which were looked into in relation to other sites where successful redevelopment has taken place. Probably the best and virtually unique example, certainly unique in this country, is the redevelopment of Highbury, Arsenal's ground in North London, where one of the grandstands was listed Grade 2. The opposing Art Deco grandstand was grouped with that listing. The other two end stands were relatively modern, the clock end and the north bank. it's a long story, which I'll cut very short. Basically, the club were the developer in this instance, and their idea initially was to simply demolish the entire stadium and build houses dotted all over the place, with no respect to the plan form whatsoever. However, because of the listing and because the site was deemed by the local authority to deserve a conservation plan prior to its redevelopment, heritage professionals were able to influence the club in its decision making and to a much better outcome all round. The one thing which I think helped sell the idea of redeveloping the two Art Deco grandstands as opposed to demolishing them was simply the fact that if those grandstands had been demolished, the maximum height to which the new development could have been built would have been 4 stories. In other words, the height of the next nearest building in that area. These two Art Deco grandstands were 7 stories high. By retaining them and imaginatively making use of the fabric, the historic fabric, and creatively using also the site of the pitch as a communal garden, the club were able to get more housing units onto that site and charge a premium price. So heritage in this instance bought us time to convince the developer, i.e. the club and its architects, to rethink their original strategy. Another example, but this time after the event, is the use of public artworks to memorialize and try to imagine where the football ground, in this case Ayresome Park in Middlesbrough, was located, by introducing football inspired sculptures in and around what was then a housing estate being constructed, so that later on, much later on, 25 years later on indeed, you can still walk around this housing estate and observe these sculptures and try to imagine where you were in the ground. The centre spot being marked by a couple of bronze football boots and one of the penalty spots by a bronze football. However, we found numerous examples of redeveloped football grounds that failed to respect both the use of the site and its original layout, provide little or no public open space, or simply try to tick the heritage box by naming some streets after famous players or parts of the stadium, or laying a plaque on the centre spot. Here's an example from in Wigan, which is the site of Springfield Park, where the housing development helpfully reminds the local kids that they're not allowed to play football or walk on the grass. Such little details, but meaningful in so many ways. Sunderland's Roker Park. Its streets are named after parts of the ground. Notice there's no relegation close. But in the middle of the stadium, former stadium, there is a small park. Again, an opportunity, one would imagine, to celebrate the use of that site. But again, littered with these signs telling you that football and other ball games are not permitted. No prizes for guessing where this is. This is Leicester, site of Filbert Street, Leicester City's former ground. Now a student housing development. And I throw in this example as well. This is a very long-running saga. This is the site of the Victoria Ground in Stoke, home to Stoke City until 1997. And for more than 20 years, this site has looked like the main image. The stands were demolished and this open space just left. You can just about make out the site of the main stand here. and the opposing stand, the terrace here. Not dissimilar, is it, to earthworks of a Roman fort, come to think of it. Anyway, there was one brick wall which survived of the entire ground, onto which a graffiti artist had written these words: "Give us a park." Well, this is an example of not listening to the local people. This wasn't the park he had in mind, a housing development of modest 2, 3 and 4 bedroom houses, again spread over the site with no attempt to set out the development in any way to reflect the history of the ground. However, there were signs after the housing development was begun that the developer was starting to listen, again a bit late in the day, but listening for a different reason. Not listening because of the heritage potential or value of the site, but listening because of the commercial spin-off from association with the heritage of the site. An important distinction. So the plan on the left is the original plan, which I collected when I went to the site pretending to be interested in buying a house. No mention at all of the fact that this was a football ground. And then the plan on the right was the plan I collected about a year later. And the marketing suite was now utilizing the fact that the site had been a former football ground to help market particular houses which happened by chance to be either on the site of the centre circle or on the edge of a penalty area, or in one instance here, the point from where Stanley Matthews scored a famous goal, what it says. And not just that, they've actually gone one step further and taken a leaf out of English Heritage's blue plaque scheme and introduced their own homespun version of a blue plaque. In this instance, those houses lie on the centre circle, and they've received the blue plaque. And the thing is that you actually pay more for these houses where they have a blue plaque or are associated in some way with a part of the ground. Okay, coming back to the York and to Bootham Crescent, and how, with all that knowledge of how one might achieve or not achieve a lasting legacy at a football ground, and taking on board what people had told us they wanted to see, what have we come up with? Well, the first thing, which is much more heritage orientated, shall we say, in the traditional sense, is to look to preserve the boundary wall of the site. This is a historic wall that predates the use of the site for football. It was a cricket ground and an athletics ground prior to 1932 when the club moved here. And so the boundary wall of that original sports venue, we felt was important to retain as much of the original brickwork as possible, and indeed take the wall back to its original height where it had been raised using concrete blocks or breeze blocks. In other words, to tidy up the boundary and perhaps also either by preservation in situ or by repairing the wall where a lean-to structure had been in a way which allowed you to read the history of the wall. We could retain not just the site of stands, but also ancillary structures like tea rooms and even a gents' urinal. But anyway, the main issue was to preserve the footprint of the original boundary wall. Linked to that physically, as well as part of the project, is this idea of creating a focal point for memory. Remember the quote from Rachel Maskell. And also crucially for orientation, because once you've lost the ground, it's going to be very difficult to reorientate yourself in that space as to where the original grounds were, parts of the ground was. So one idea we came up with very early on was to try to preserve some physical fabric. And conveniently, there is a rather interesting and probably unique survival at York City. Below the popular stand, that's the main long stand opposite the main stand. And it's a tunnel. Now, those football fans listening who are old enough to remember pre-segregation football, when you could actually move around the ground without being penned in to a particular end or paddock. We may be familiar with the idea of switching ends at half time. So in other words, you stood behind the goal your team was kicking towards. But at half time, of course, that changed. So you needed to get to the other end of the stadium. And this tunnel provided that means of access. And you can imagine the sorts of things that went on as rival fans passed each other in this rather narrow space. Anyway, I was quite taken by this whole idea because I couldn't think of another example which survived. And also there was another layer of history associated with the tunnel in that it was used as an air raid shelter during the Second World War. So preserving a section of this tunnel seemed an important thing to do. And as it is attached to the boundary wall, it seemed also an obvious thing to focus on. And if we could preserve a section which was at the halfway line, then it will help orientate people as well as provide those points of memory. There's a picket fence in front of the popular stand, the original picket fence from 1932, and that we also thought could be reused to surround this section of retained stand. Here's a sort of a laser scan of that part of the ground, just showing you a 3D version and a section through the stand. So we're looking at preserving about a 6-meter length of the pop stand, including the tunnel, including repurposing some metal railings and gates. And around the base of this feature will be laid out a memorial garden. This was another thing that people were particularly keen to have on the site. A number of people's ashes we know have been spread on the ground, and a number of caskets have been buried around the touchlines. Somewhere where those caskets can be relocated, where future caskets might be interred, was going to be important. There's not going to be a memorial garden at the new stadium, and anyway, anyone whose ashes in the future would want to be associated, we would have thought, at Bootham rather than the new stadium. So a memorial garden around the base of this retained section of stand is one of the main outcomes from this project. And another intriguing discovery from, again, consultation, because it's not written up anywhere, and it only appears very briefly in this film, is the so-called 5-minute flag. Now, again, I was never heard of this situation, but in the 1930s, particularly when this photograph I think is taken, very few people would have owned a pocket watch or a wristwatch, and there was no clock at the ground. So if you wanted to know what the time was, or more importantly, how many minutes there were to go before the end of the match, so you could either cheer your team on or nip out early to catch a train or a bus and avoid the crowds, then this flag came to your rescue. It was lowered 5 minutes before the end of the game. And everyone would watch out for this and then either, as I say, cheer the team on or start making tracks. So I thought something which replicated, if not exactly in the same position, but replicated a flagpole with the original club flag on it, flying permanently on the site after the club had gone, would be, an important marker for the site. So that's another suggestion we put forward. And all these suggestions went into the discussion, went into the melting pot with the council, the planning authority, with Persimmons and their various consultants, and various iterations of the housing scheme were put forward. This is the second main scheme you're looking at here. The first one did what everybody else has done, because we hadn't been properly introduced to Persimmons at the time, and they were just doing their normal thing of building as many houses as they could cram onto the site without any reference to the football heritage at all. However, by the time we'd actually sat down with them a couple of meetings, we had convinced them of the merit of doing it our way. And this was their response, which wasn't the final version. I'll show you that in a minute, but it shows the section of retained terrace. It shows the location of a flagpole. They also introduced on their own bat a memorial garden replicating the centre circle. The red line, by the way, is the boundary wall. So that is retained without any question. My concern here was, well, let's just look at the next slide and you'll see. Superimpose that over the actual ground, and you can see there's very little reference to the layout of the stadium. Now that may not be possible for all sorts of reasons, but I thought one thing that should be possible would be to orientate certainly the central area of housing with the orientation of the ground. Why put it askew so that all your features you're retaining are askew to the development? It seemed illogical. And by skewing it properly round slightly to reflect the original layout, they could probably cram in a couple more houses. And that's what we managed to convince them to do. Also, you can't see it here, but the centre circle wasn't actually on the centre circle. This is quite a common problem where housing developments have been superimposed on a football ground, and they just replicated a centre circle which has no relationship to the original location. And again, why not try to make it? Why not try to replicate it? So this is what went to planning and what has now been approved. So we have our boundary wall retained, we have our section of terrace, we have managed to convince them to reorientate the housing so it reflects the original orientation of the ground, which means that the centre circle is now in its correct position and is part of public open space. The memorial garden is around the base and not in the centre circle. And the flagpole is now happily in the correct location. So that's where we are at the moment. Planning permission was granted in the summer. There are a number of conditions attached to it for a 106 agreement, which I understand is still yet to be signed by the housing developer. I may be wrong, it may have happened recently. But in those planning conditions are all the things we've been discussing with them, and the need also for long-term management and maintenance of the site is one of those issues which we perhaps might explore in the discussion. But on that note, I'll hand back to Neil.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jason. That was fantastic. There is one excellent question that's come up, which I'm going to ask straight away, because I think it's really interesting when you start to look at the sequence of events that you've talked about and those other examples. So Matt Amy's asked, do the ideas discussed today also apply to preserving historic stadiums before they're developed? So Matt is an archaeological consultant, and he's a lifelong Pompey fan, and he worries about the future of Fratton Park.
Of course he does.
So what's really interesting is in that question there, when do you start? When do you start thinking about these things? Now, interestingly, the first examples you gave, it was too late. The demolition, the movement had actually gone. In some senses, with Bootham Crescent, the decision to go had already been made. The ground had been sold, but planning permission hadn't been granted, so you had a window then. So Jason Keith, timing, where do you sit on that?
Well, I'd certainly the discussions that you can have with the fan base and the club. I mean, you can take them at any time. I would, because it's almost inevitable that a club is going to move, in this kind of current economic and sports situation. So I'd say do it as soon as you can, and I'd say that for any venue. As I was saying, the idea here was that we would produce something that could be applied to any sort of leisure heritage site. So yeah, just do it now.
And maybe force people to think about such places as heritage. That's part of the problem I've encountered over 20 odd years of working in the sort of sporting heritage sector. It's not a traditional, or it wasn't when I started. It was a very difficult ask to get the heritage world and the heritage sector to recognize sport as being something worthy of recognition as heritage, never mind protection. There is only one football ground which is listed in the whole of England, and that is Craven Cottage. And that's simply because it's the one that it survived out of all the others, and just happened to be, dare I say, a stone's throw from Savile Row or wherever the English heritage now are. There's a danger, isn't there, that the heritage world has not recognised this internally, yet the fan base probably doesn't think about this until a place is threatened. And then, as with other sites, the heritage argument is then vocalized. Getting clubs to recognize that they have a history, they have a heritage, was also extremely difficult when you're dealing with, on the whole, businessmen, sometimes not even living in this country. You're dealing with boards made up of, usually inclusive of, developers and money men. You're not going to convince them that heritage is something they should be investing in, because and we found this initially at Bootham Crescent, didn't we, Keith? Because of the fear that somehow we were going to stop them doing something, whether that was redeveloping a particular part of the ground, or in the case of Bootham Crescent, redeveloping the entire ground. Heritage was seen to be something which will get in the way of what they want to do. And the only reason we were able to get a seat at the table at Bootham Crescent is because Historic England were funding the project, not the club, not the local authority, it was something which we could fund ourselves and do ourselves, but because we had the planning authority on our side, we were able to bring the club and the housing developer on board earlier in the discussion. So I think the difficulty is convincing both clubs to recognize their own heritage and history, and that they are, they should be mindful of this legacy in whatever they do, whether they stay put and redevelop a stand or whether, I mean, Manchester City doesn't even have a club museum. Wealthiest club on the planet did have one, but it made its curator redundant because it couldn't afford it. I mean, if man, you know, Everton, whose ground is under threat at Goodison Park when the club finally get planning permission potentially for a new stadium, although that's a long-running saga, they only acquired a heritage, if you like, of objects associated with the history of the club through acquisition through an auction. They didn't preserve any of this thing themselves. They relied on other people doing it and then buying it in. So there's a danger that the clubs, and when we worked at Middlesbrough, we went to the club, what records have you got of Ayresome Park? They pointed at a filing cabinet, one drawer of which had some photographs of former players. And that was their entire archive of history. So these places don't value history or heritage. They are inherently thinking of the next game. It's a future they're concerned about.
To me,
the next game, the next win, the next balance sheet, not looking backwards, sadly.
I think that's really interesting. I often use the analogy that actually football supporters are the best historians we've actually got, because you'll get supporters from two rival clubs who on a Saturday will go back to the start of football history to justify why their club is better than the other club and why they will win on that day. Well, that's a pure historical process. That's how historians argue about questions about the past. They use the past to help justify what they want to happen in the present and the narratives they actually want to give. So this idea that football doesn't have a heritage soul, I find, you know, very, very challenging. I just don't agree with it. But what that means is it's the fans who have to take control of that. It's the fans who sit in the stands. It's the fans who always stand in certain places to watch those games. So every time a stand is renovated, the fans should argue about what they want to happen to parts of that and what it means to them. So again, I think going back to Matt's question is actually now is the right time. Don't wait for anything to happen. You can be gathering these stories. You know, I often remember where I was sitting in various cricket grounds when certain events of various cricket matches happened by where I was sitting and such like. Well, you can share those experiences. They're the experiences you never lose. They're the ones where the memories and the attachments to those places actually derive from.
Yeah.
So I think, Matt, what's really important is to get that conversation going. Only the fans effectively can legitimize that and build up that, if you like, that groundswell of value that becomes so important.
Yeah.
And just kind of building on that about the fans and the fan base, I mean, Jason and I were very clear that we weren't going to impose anything on the fans. We only responded to what the fan base wanted. So we have our ideas of heritage, but we weren't going to impose that on the fans.
No, correct.
Okay, right. I've got another question for you now. This one comes from Claire. Now, Claire actually works for the CVA, and so she's a joint panelist. Effectively, she's actually set everything up, and she can't, for that reason, use the Q&A. So she put it in the chat. So she says, have you thought about how you can bring in the wider area to this process? For example, pubs, meeting places, etc., that fans use on their way to and from the match.
Yeah.
Not the central focus, but significant in the experience of fans.
Yeah. That was a big thing, big part of my original kind of project brief. The thing we were going to look at was if you like, the match day experience, and that would be the whole thing about how you get from where you live to the ground, where you went for your pint to meet friends, where you bought your pie, where you bought your fish and chips, the effect it had on businesses, the effect it had on people who didn't like the fans gathering outside their house. All of those things, the whole match day experience was a big part of it. And Jason and Ed White, who was our cameraman for the videos, I mean, they did quite a lot of work on that, didn't you?
Sure. just as a bit of a plug, on the Historic England YouTube channel, if you type in Bootham Crescent, you'll find a sequence of short films we've been making as the project proceeded. And one of those films, I think it's number 4, or one of the later ones anyway, focuses on exactly this question of how it will impact, how the new stadium relocating to out of town will impact on match day routines. So, sorry, my phone has just gone off, which is annoying.
I find that a really interesting point about those places. So I live in York, and for the last 15 years I've lived next to near to Bootham Crescent. And for me, the really interesting thing I'm going to miss, and there's 2 things I'm going to miss: that sense of anticipation when you see all these fans walking towards Bootham Crescent. You know, the thing about this ground is it was entirely accessible by foot. No one really drove. You always walked there. So you're going to miss this sort of these hordes of people, the children with the parents, with the boy, with the dad, you know, walking along. You can see a sense of anticipation. It's York City, so it's normally always actually going in the wrong direction, and you know, they'd all come out looking really sad, and you could tell what was going on. But the thing that actually was far more meaningful for me was the soundscape of the ground, because I only ever went a couple of times. I'm not particularly a football fan, but when I walk my dog, there are parts of that local area I could stand where if the crowd cheered, the sound would reverberate off the terrace houses. It was almost like there was one place where there was a very large wall where it was almost like you got into this sound cone of it just reverberating off the walls. And it was extraordinary. And it was like that goosebump moment. What's going on? And it was just so evocative. Now, for me, the ground's going to go. You're going to lose that. How do you replace that? Where does that essence go? Which I think is, again, really interesting. So it's just not the physicality. There's this whole sound and language scape that potentially is going to be missed as well. How do we record that now?
One of the spin-off projects, which we hope this project will inspire, is, and one of the consequences of this decision to retain part of the ground and to retain it in a particular location, was that early on an idea was floated by one of the consultees that you could have an augmented reality version of Bootham Crescent on your mobile phone, geo-positioned to this retained section of terrace, which you could then sit on, and it would replicate what the ground looked like, both in terms of its townscape and the vista from that position, but also potentially the soundscape. As long as it didn't interfere with too many residents, I would have thought that would be feasible if it was only on your mobile phone or tablet. And one of the reasons why you saw the section through the ground as a 3D laser scan, well, that laser scan has been extended now to the entire ground to allow such 3D replication of the ground and its geo-referenced augmented self to appear on your mobile phone. That is early technology and early ideas, but it may be a way of replicating the soundscape as well.
It links quite nicely to a question I've got from Alison Edwards, who asks whether there is going to be any acknowledgement of the club's history in the new stadium, or is this going to be a new sort of future focused project?
Yes, good question. There was a lot of discussion about what was going to be retained from what there was at the ground, what could be sold at the ground, what was associated with Bootham Crescent, and what could then be moved to the new stadium. So we thought about that a lot, and it was one of the things that really struck me about the project is the way that people were thinking about how you made new heritage and how they were going to make a new heritage at the new ground. And that was kind of a lesson I learned from it. But certainly things like the clock over the popular stand, that was donated by a particular family. They want to see that move to the new ground, and that would go inside the sort of the entrance hall. So it could be one of those things, you know, we'll meet under the clock at the entrance to the to the new ground. But yes, we thought about that a lot. Yeah.
Just worth mentioning for those who aren't aware that the new ground is going to be a shared stadium. It's not just going to be for York City, but also for the local rugby club. So there was some concern expressed to us that having too much memorabilia or referencing of Bootham Crescent in the new stadium would, in a way, conflict with its dual purpose and dual use. And I got the impression, apart from the clock, I think not much is going to be taken to the new stadium, and that they're because of this need to almost maintain neutrality within the stadium confines. We did suggest, didn't we, Keith, some photographs wouldn't go amiss. And maybe they could also broadcast things on big screens, which were pertinent to the game they were playing. Past matches could be screened. So there was some referencing of Bootham Crescent somewhere on match days, but as a permanent presence on the new site, it seemed that was a non-starter because of the need to maintain this neutrality.
I quite like that, not least that because the community stadium wasn't ready in time, the rugby league club actually moved into Bootham Crescent for the last season. So, there's these amazing stories, but not least what's also really interesting is the rugby league club suffered the same fate in the 1980s. Its ground was sold off, redeveloped in the centre of town. That's why we had the location of where the community stadium is now. It was the Rydell York Stadium. That's why, in a sense, became the focus of moving. And rugby league clubs and identity, they've been an incredibly dynamic and moving feast over the years. So again, I'm really interested in how this translates into other sports. This isn't just a question for football and where it goes. In the chat, we had a really good point from Elizabeth Robson, who just picked up on what Claire was actually saying around the cultural heritage and community connections that contribute to the sort of places people want to live in, the physical environment around them. In some small way, have we been able to create a slightly more distinctive location for housing within York by arguing this, or have we just been given the minimum possible by the home builders?
I think we've achieved quite a lot of what we set out to achieve, and judging from what the housing developers' initial plans were likely to be, not that I think for a minute they would have got planning permission, but their initial ideas wouldn't have been at all fitting, not just in terms of the reuse of a sports venue, but in terms of the style of housing and materials they were intending originally to use. So a lot has shifted our way, having had a seat at the table, in the same way as having a seat at the table at Highbury shifted things our way at the time when that was being discussed. So there are, I think, distinct advantages for having the heritage voice involved in the design and choice of materials, etc., on a non-heritage site, in terms of its, it's not a listed building, it's not, in this instance, having it's on the edge of a conservation area, isn't it, Keith, which gave historic England the opportunity to step in and help shape things. But shaping is what this project's been about. It's capturing those memories, shaping the place so that it better reflects what the local fan base and local residents wanted to see, and preserve some legacy of the use of the site into the future. And let's face it, at Highbury, as will be the case at Bootham Crescent, the majority of people who want to own properties on that site are going to be fans of the respective football clubs, if they can afford them.
Okay, right. We're getting some really good questions. And what I'd like us to do is just move on to really one of the challenges we set ourselves out when we first started thinking about doing this session was about methodology, or to phrase his term, his toolkit for how you do it elsewhere. What is that toolkit? Now, I'm really interested to hear from you, Jason and Keith, what you think it are. Might be what things do you need to ask? I mean, I've certainly managed to capture 6 things that I think are actually fundamental. But let's see, what would your top 2 key issues need to capture are? So, Jason, how would you start?
I'm not sure this merits top 2, but the first thing that springs to mind is that the series of films we've made during the project has helped to capture not just people's views and thoughts, but also force them to start thinking about heritage and about the site in ways which in an ordinary meeting they may not have articulated. And indeed, in some cases, it could be quite helpful to have a director of the football club or the local MP or a planning officer captured on film saying something which they then can't wheedle out of later on. So useful to have a record of the progress of the project captured on film. It builds momentum behind the project, it galvanizes interest, and it also traps a few people into making decisions and saying things they then can't retract.
So that's an interesting one for Matt down in Pompey. What he really needs to do is get some of the directors to actually say what the club means, the location, the place means to them. Yeah. You can do these things quite subtly by just asking them to say when they first visited. Yeah. You know, what was their connection? How did they get there? Who did they come with? And then you actually find that there can be some really interesting stories when you get into that. But it's what you're articulating there is the need to establish meaning. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've got to have that groundswell of meaning. Why is this place relevant to actual people? And that's talking to them and communicating about it.
It's talking, communicating, and recording their views, and making sure that those views come back and feed into, and they can see that they've been fed back into the process of design, rather than just ticking a box. I mean, I no doubt consultations have happened before during relocations of sports venues, but it doesn't lead necessarily to what those people want, because ultimately other issues, financial and others, will intercede, and the heritage argument is conveniently placed to one side. So yeah, I think capturing those views in a way which means that you're able to replay them at appropriate moments is quite helpful. Also, having the local authority on board right from the beginning, and the relevant conservation officers and planning officers knowing what you're doing and knowing why you're doing it, it makes their job a lot easier. I mean, the planning conditions and the planning report issuing planning permission was largely taken from reports that Historic England had submitted as part of the project. So it was nice to see that. And our reports, as Keith reminded us, were based on what people told us. So all of that is now firmly come back. You know, all that information has led to something, and a trail can be seen between the original interview and the decision. So yeah, I think getting all of that down by one means or another, but film is quite a useful one, because you can broadcast it on YouTube and thousands of people see it. And we built up quite a support from outside the York City fan base for what we're doing on the basis of that. And I think that, Keith, is this correct? It's still the most watched sequence of videos historically.
Yeah.
Well, that tells you something, doesn't it?
Keith, can I ask you, what do you think's the most important thing in your toolkit?
I think that the thing that I've learned is the way you go about talking to people and convincing them that they are heritage practitioners and heritage experts themselves. And I kind of, Jason kind of hinted at this kind of earlier on, that, you know, the club thought, you know, heritage, what are you talking about? We're not a heritage site. And then once you started to make the argument and people sort of then started to see themselves as heritage practitioners, lots of things opened up then, lots of stories opened up, and then people then started to talk about the kind of the familial connections with supporting something, that you know, you take your children to the ground because your dad took you to the ground. All of those things started to be released once people started to think of themselves as, you know, as heritage experts of their place, and that was really good.
I think that's excellent. So you've now taken my 6 points to 7 with that final one, Keith, which is excellent, but sort of wraps it up. So what I just thought I'm going to do is I'm going to pose, these are my 7 steps to how you might approach this subject moving forward. Okay, and this is from listening from what you've talked about this evening. So my number 1, top of the list, I think, is what Rachel Maskell was talking about, the focal point for memory. Okay, that's, I think, where we're starting from. You've got to ask the question, okay, if we're going to look at this, what might be our focal point for memory? I think an interesting aside to that is there is definitely something you can commercialize out, and understanding that really important for those initial discussions. I think the second thing that came out to me is orientation. That plan had no meaning until the 3rd version, until the orientation happened. So understanding orientation is fundamental to help understand the feeling. I think point 3, some element of fabric, some element of having a piece of fabric, an element of fabric. That can be new fabric, so your flagpole may well be new, but the flagpole, the fabric, that essence of what it was, really, really. Number 4, timing. I think timing is absolutely critical. Yeah. No moment is too late. Start now. Yeah. Get that timing. The earlier you're actually having these conversations, the more information you have, the more meaning you actually get. Number 5, really important to transfer meaning and understanding to the new venue or the new place. And I think we touched on some of that with some of the conversation about what's been done. I think so much more can be done there. You know, you're never going to transfer the feeling of walking to Bootham Crescent to the new stadium. People will drive to it or get a bus. Yeah. How do you transfer meaning? Number 6, whatever you do must have meaning, and that is based on understanding and agreed understanding. So again, Jason, what you were talking about in terms of filming, capturing people's feelings, people's stories, people's association is absolutely critical. So that understanding, that meaning has to underpin everything. But then the real point, I think that Keith just nailed at the end there, number 7, is this is heritage. These are heritage stories, and that everybody writes. Everyone's experience are really, really important. If we capture these stories, then we can go to a Roman theatre or a Roman amphitheatre or a Roman games site and actually start thinking about what the people were thinking about when they were going there. How did they walk? What was their journey to that site? If you go to the Rose Theatre in London, or any of Shakespeare's theatres, this is what's coming to light. You know, we could actually replicate this in concert theatres, concert venues, music theatres, anywhere where people really gather and there's an experience of going to actually visit it. So what I found really interesting is from what you've got there is that they're just 7 points about what you're actually doing, and is that Keith's toolkit in there that we can replicate and do elsewhere. Now we're slightly over, so I'm at time. So in the last 5 minutes, what I'd really like you to do with that toolkit idea, there are 2 things. What are future projects? Where else might we go? But I've also got a really brilliant question. This is again from Claire in the chat zone, where she asks this really, really brilliant question. Okay, so this is fine for events that have grounds, but what about those sporting events that don't have grounds in the same way as football, cricket and rugby, such as cycling clubs or potentially, long distance running clubs? What do you do about those, where they might be just taking their sporting exercise in multitude of places? Do you think there's a way of moving on to that? So there are two questions there. Where else are you going to try and do this? Where else are there live potential projects? And then what about the even more ephemeral heritage of non-location specific sporting activity?
Right.
Yeah, blimey. I looked at that question when it came out. I thought that is a really good question. It's time for me to go. Okay. So, Jason, in terms of grounds, you have some ideas.
Well, there are, as we've heard, Everton, Luton, Lincoln City, Portsmouth. These are clubs considering ground relocations, and so whatever toolkit comes out of this project will be applicable, particularly in those instances, one would hope, so long as, you know, bodies, the local planning authorities and Historic England are consistent with the advice being offered based on experiences like this. So, but each of them will have their own peculiarities and ideas as well. So being flexible, I think, is going to be also important. In terms of, I mean, and that is a grounds which exists now and may not exist in the future. So getting in early, and as Matt said about Portsmouth. There are, however, grounds which long ago were lost. So long ago, in some cases, I've worked on a couple, that whole generations of current fans, 2 generations of current fans in one case, have no memory at all of the former ground, or indeed the former club, because the club in one instance I'm thinking of also went out of existence as well as their ground. So there are opportunities in some instances, rare though they are, because most historic grounds which were lost in the past have been redeveloped from retail parks or supermarkets, and the majority are under housing, as we've seen. But occasionally there are some which are left vacant, like Bradford Park Avenue, a ground that went out of existence in 1970, but which survives in part simply because a covenant on the original Victorian site only permits the site to be used for sport or recreation, and therefore it couldn't be redeveloped for anything other than sport or recreation. And it survives because it's now partly a all-weather cricket training centre. But the terraces survive at Park Avenue, and you can still read in the landscape the presence of a football ground. Now, when I first saw that site, it reminded me of Angkor Wat, because the entire stadium had been overgrown by trees. The terraces were covered in trees. The gents' urinal had a tree growing through it. It was the most odd place, but because it reminded me of an archaeological site, I approached it as an archaeologist would approach any site, even though it was built in 1907. Why not excavate part of it to see what material culture can tell us about the use of that place? That's a whole new webinar, but it's a project we did a few years ago, and a book was produced which was shortlisted for the William Hill Sports Book of the Year. So it shows that there's a wider interest in this subject beyond football and beyond heritage and archaeology to literature and in sport in general. Another project which I've been trying to get off the ground for a number of years is in Ayresome Park. We touched on this, if you remember. The artworks had been dotted around the housing estate. There is the opportunity there, because the housing estate was not actually completed. one end of the ground, the original home end of the ground, the Holgate end, actually was never developed. It was flattened, but it wasn't built on. And so there is the opportunity there to do some, maybe to apply some very clever contemporary geophysical survey techniques, to look below the surface to see what survives of that huge terrace, and maybe to even excavate part of it and involve local people and school kids in the process. And for that generation, the current generation of school children and young fans of Middlesbrough Football Club, who won't have even heard of Ayresome Park or be able to pinpoint it on a map, wouldn't that be an interesting project for them? That's their Roman archaeology. For them, that's their anchor wall. You know, so why something doesn't have to be that old to be archaeology, as we know, but convincing people of that and convincing that football has an archaeology is still difficult, but fascinating when you can pull it off. So I would draw your attention to the Bradford Park Avenue project we did. It's called Breaking Ground, and also the potential project at Ayresome Park in Middlesbrough, which hopefully will receive some sort of funding next year.
Yeah, that really does sound brilliant. Keith, we're not letting you off the hook. Come on, you've got to give us some thoughts on sporting events with no grounds.
I'd just say Ayresome Park would be top of my list for something to do. Yeah, I mean I would like to know why people choose the routes they do. Whether cycling and running, what, you know, do they, you know, take in places of memory, sort of experience, all of those things? How are their routes associated with them, and how they envisage that place? I don't know. It's you know, it's a really interesting question. I'll give it a lot more thought. But it's how you choose the route.
Yeah. So where I started thinking was the whole sales pitch of the Tour de France coming to Yorkshire was really interesting, which actually used Yorkshire's heritage and its geography and its geology as a way of saying, in a sense, coming here. Now, it's created heritage infrastructure. So I drove past Ripley yesterday, and of course there is a stone piece of artwork that records the Tour de France going past Ripley. But you know, for the month after the Tour de France, there was all the writing on the roads. Well, wouldn't it be fascinating if someone got the film, because it was all from aerial photography, and rewrote some of that writing, redid some of that writing, or how do you capture that? Do that. So actually, I think what Claire actually pointed out there is a really fascinating thing that you know, the Tour de France also has had an impact in actually the Tour de Yorkshire, that actually all these more people are actually cycling. They don't, in a sense, they don't need a venue. They need to do what Keith's doing, is how do they create their route every weekend? And you know, do they have a preferred route, and what are their experiences? How do they navigate? How, you know, what's the conversation in their head? I would find absolutely fascinating.
I mean, there is one sort of cycle route that is a heritage site. I mean, obviously there is the Tour de France route, but the one in Knaresborough, Knaresborough to Harrogate, because that is a historic cycle route that was used by, I've forgotten her name now, the really famous.
There is also a brilliant piece of road between is it Otley and Ilkley, where there's a measured mile, and you actually have a signpost that actually is part of, you know, when you're cycling, that's where you do your mile speed distance, and that, you know, that's sort of a little bit of sort of infrastructure and that picks up Otley's tradition of cycling, you know, dating back 80, 90 years. Matt has just come in. You know, surely something like the Tour de France adds heritage value to an area it passes through. Absolutely agree. You know, much as the Olympics did, and where the Olympic torch went, actually. But I suppose what's really interesting is just how dynamic this conversation becomes, and how many people it affects. And
Beryl Burton,
surely for like us.
Sorry, Beryl Burton was the woman I was thinking of, the really famous cyclist, female cyclist.
Okay, we're over our time now, which is fantastic. So I can't see any more questions. If anyone's furiously quick at typing and have got a final question, I think what we'll probably do is leave it there. I've got a couple of things I need to do. So first of all, I absolutely need to thank Jason and Keith for putting the talks together and actually coming on and hosting the discussion with me. I think it's hugely important. I think it's definitely something for the Council of British Archaeology to promote and do, because it is so inclusive and it actually just reaches other places we don't traditionally go, but can be grounded in all the sorts of questions that we love as archaeologists. So I think it's a really brilliant subject. So thank you to both of you. I also do just need to let you know that when, just before we finish, Claire is going to pop up a quick poll questionnaire for you, which we'd like you just to fill out and hit yes or no. So this is how you feel the event went. So we're just going to ask you, how do you rate it for level of enjoyment? Did you learn anything new? And would you take part in Festival of Archaeology events in the future? So again, is this the sort of thing you want to see? When we go and the webinar comes to an end, you'll also get an email from Claire and our organising team just to ask you for some more in-depth feedback about the Festival of Archaeology and what you might like to see and how it went for you and how well the organisation went. So please do fill those in for us and let us know how you got on. Excellent. Everyone learned something new, which is fascinating. Well done, Jason. I'll make sure Keith gives you a bonus. Keith, fantastic. Everyone wants to
we
take
are
part.
recording this, aren't we? Yes.
We are. Absolutely. I no longer work for Historic England, so no monetary
I'll
comeback.
take that up with Kath Buxton. Yeah.
But obviously, again, I would actually point out Historic England do support the festival, and they do actually support this project. And I think it's a really brilliant example of just how the reach of what you can get to. Look at that. And look at that, brilliant. Everyone thought it was level of enjoyment was very high or high. So to the pair of you, thank you so much.
No, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining in. And on that, what we'll do is we'll pass it back over to Claire, who will shut us down and say thank you and good night. Thanks.
Thank you. Good night.